Forward TV. The world is thinking.
I'll just tell you a couple of things about the New York Salon, about what we're about, and then I'll quickly come over to our panellists, because I know that we'd like to get into the debate tonight, because we've got a great panel this evening with some really wonderful speakers. We set up the New York Salon because we are passionate believers in ideas and debating, and think that there's a space for public debate where adults can robustly argue ideas in a civil fashion, and where adult ideas can be taken seriously and we can argue, and it doesn't become about name calling and get reduced to childish tantrums, but it can be about a serious consideration of ideas, where sometimes today many people think people have become cynical about ideas and politics generally. We've had a whole range of different debates, which if people would like to have a look at them, they can look at the New York Salon website, www.nysalon.org. I'm going to talk a little bit about our partners, because for this event, this is part of something called the Battle Satellites. We've partnered with the Institute of Ideas in London, as well as Time Out New York, and of course Barnes & Noble. Fora TV will be filming this evening, and you're able to see them at fora.tv. And we have someone, Janice, who's going to mention a few words of support from the Institute of Ideas and the Battle of Ideas in London.
Okay. Hi. This is a message from Shirley Dent, the Battle Satellites 2008 Director and the Institute of Ideas in London. We are delighted to be working with the New York Salon to bring the first ever Battle of Ideas satellite to New York and the USA. The debate in Barnes & Noble tonight is the culmination of the Battle of Ideas 2008 program. And in turn, the Battle of Ideas is the result of what we at the Institute of Ideas have believed in and worked for since 2000, when Director Claire Fox founded the Institute of Ideas. Claire was convinced then that we needed robust, no-holds-barred public debate, and that the public was hungry for such debate. Since the first Battle of Ideas in 2005, we have sold out the festival every year. In 2008, we expanded the festival. Not only did we have increased capacity at the festival weekend with 300 speakers and an audience of close to 2,000, we also developed a program of battle satellite debates supported by Time Out London and Time Out New York. These satellites are standalone events on everything from street dance to British foreign policy in some of the most cutting-edge and intellectually lively venues in London, New York, and Frankfurt. Yet every one of these debates is very much in the spirit and part of the Battle of Ideas Festival. When we say free speech allowed and the shaping of future through debate, we mean it. When Claire Fox closed this year's weekend festival, she spoke about the seriousness of the economic crisis and the urgency of taking ideas seriously. But she didn't leave it there. Getting to the heart of why arguing over ideas matter and why we believe so much in the Battle of Ideas and the Battle Satellites, Claire reminded us that the economy and society, now and in the future, are not just a matter of fate. We shape the world, and what happens next is down to us and what we do. There are few better debates that illustrate the importance of trying to understand the present in order to better shape the future than China, a new hope or threat to the world. We hope you all enjoy this debate, which we know will be as hard fought as it is thoughtful. Best wishes, Shirley Dent and the Battle of Ideas Committee.
Thanks, Janice. So it seems as though China's been on the tips of everyone's tongues, not just because of the Beijing Olympics, but almost there's no debate and discussion that happens today that, in terms of China, that doesn't raise very contentious points, whether it's to do with the expansion of the economy and development and the implications for the environment, or whether it's to do with the international role that China will play and the implications of that throughout Africa and its relationship to Tibet, or exported toys and food, or even the discussion about domestic freedoms and democracy. And interestingly, people may have seen Fareed Zakaria's recent Newsweek article, but he says this: everyone knows that China is a major power and our representation there is important. But right now we need Beijing like never before. China is the key to America getting through the worsening economic crisis. The American ambassador in Beijing will need to make sure that China sees its interests as aligned with America's, or else things could get very, very ugly. Now that's one perspective, but obviously, not always our impressions are not always the same as people in China, and perhaps some people may argue that we see things through our own particular prism, and people may well be aware of the recent Pew Global Attitudes report that suggested that 86% of people surveyed in China are actually quite happy with the direction of the country, compared to only 23% in the USA. So we've got a great panel this evening, and we'll be debating a lot of these ideas. I'm going to introduce them, and they're going to do their fairly short introductions. And the way it works at the New York Salon is that once the introductions are made, we'll talk a little bit here, but we're going to quickly come over to the audience. And we have two real kind of rules. One is that anyone's allowed to say absolutely anything, and people can't freak out because we're adults. And the second is that we allow them to do that in a civil fashion, and we all get a chance to speak, and we don't heckle and stop them from doing that. So, to begin with, sitting to my far left is Brendan O'Neill, who's actually flown in from the UK. And Brendan's the editor of Spiked, an online publication, as well as a writer for a number of different publications, including the New Statesman, the Christian Science Monitor, BBC News Website Weekly, and also a blogger for the UK Guardian, Comment is Free. And he's just recently published a book, Can I Recycle My Granny, which means grandmother, and 39 other eco-dilemmas. Directly next to me is Elizabeth Economy, who's the Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and is also an author of The River Runs Black, The Environmental Challenges to China's Future. If you want to see the bigger bios of these guys, which are fairly significant and impressive, do look at either New York Salon website or the Time Out New York papers that were recently published, because they give you a very long chronology of their achievements. Directly next to me on this side is Charles W. Freeman III, who is the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the former Managing Director of China Alliance and the US Chief China Trade Organizer. And Charles is the co-author of China's Rise, Challenges and Opportunities. And finally, on my far right is Brooke Gladstone, who I'm sure many of you also know. She's the co-host and managing editor of NPR's On the Media, very well known in New York and elsewhere. So, Brendan.
Thank you, Alan. Is this on? Yes? No? No? Thank you. In April earlier this year, the Olympic torch came to London, and something rather extraordinary happened. Britain's political and media elite went mad. They kind of became gripped by a collective hysteria. And the focus of their madness, the reason they kind of lost their marbles, was that the Olympic flame was guarded by 15 Chinese security guards. Now, these 15 security guards were not wearing uniforms. They were wearing light blue tracksuits. They were armed with nothing more ominous than Zippo lighters, so that they could relight the flame if anyone managed to put it out. They did not manhandle any anti-China protesters or even speak to any of them. And in accompanying the flame, they were doing something perfectly normal. It is very common for foreign security officials to attend sporting events around the world, whether it's the Olympic flame making its journey around the globe, the Tour de France, or whatever. And yet, these 15 Chinese men were treated as some kind of weird invading force that would either pollute or even destroy London. The day after the torch travelled through London, there was what can only reasonably be described as a demented reaction to these guys and their presence in the city. In the media coverage, the 15 men were referred to as vile, horrible, robotic, mysterious, retarded goons. One British sporting official said they did not speak English, they were thugs. Obviously anyone who doesn't speak English is a thug. A British TV presenter who carried the flame on part of its journey through London said that the men were very robotic. That notion was repeated when the flame went to Paris, where a French official also referred to the 15 Chinese men as robots. One British newspaper led with a front page headline, "Horrible Chinese thugs," in capital letters. Another newspaper said, and I quote, These goons were probably just following orders, having no doubt been told that their organs will be harvested if they let protesters run off with a torch. Because, of course, as we all know, the Chinese like to steal people's organs and sell them or eat them or something, I don't know. A leading Tory politician in Britain warned these men in tracksuits that Trafalgar Square is not Tiananmen Square. Clearly worried that they might use their Zippo lighters to burn and massacre people in the central London. And this hysteria continued as the flame went around the world. In San Francisco, one columnist wrote about these monsters who enforced China's gruesome organ trade and asked what were they doing on the streets of America. The blogosphere was bursting with debate about these Chinese thugs who had apparently taken over England, and there were suggestions on blogs that people should take mace and spray them in the eyes when they see them. And the whole spectacle really reached its nadir in Sydney, where the supposedly liberal new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, refused to allow the Chinese officials to run with the flame. And he was congratulated in newspaper headlines which said, and again I quote, "Rudd won't let the Chinese invade." And as I was watching this, Salem-style outbreak of mass hysteria, I thought to myself, what is going on here? How could something as normal as foreign security officials protecting the Olympic flame give rise to debates about thugs, stolen organs, vampires, invasions, and all the rest of it? What's our problem? And that is when I realized the fact that fundamentally the China issue is our problem. It is a sense of fear and uncertainty here in the West that makes China appear threatening to us today. It is our own sense of confusion, our own sense of disillusionment, if you like, that makes China appear strange and overbearing to us, rather than anything that the Chinese themselves are doing. In essence, we lack the political maturity to engage with China in any kind of constructive fashion. China is continually presented as the other in Western public debate these days, and it's presented effectively as the moral opposite of the West. We fear China, this populous, modern, economically expanding nation, precisely because it runs counter to the petty politics of Western societies today. It runs counter to our celebration of sustainability rather than economic growth. It runs counter to our preference for environmentalism over city building. And it runs counter to our desire for small populations with small carbon footprints, rather than billions of people running around working, eating, and driving cars as they have the nerve to do in China. China continually appears as an affront to Western low horizons. So it's never enough to report the facts about China today. They must always be accompanied by scare stories and a really kind of pernicious moralizing. So we're never simply told how much CO2 China is emitting. Instead, we're given media hype about a place where rivers run black, where there is an environmental dystopia, where dolphins die and people are poisoned. Some writers discuss China's real environmental problems as if they were a new plague or a world war. And again, I think that reflects our own discomfort with economic growth, when we can only ever see its downsides, its residue, rather than the immense benefits that it has for Chinese society. And again, we're never simply told how many people China has. Instead, we're treated to these kind of really horrible, dire warnings that it's swarming with too many people, that there are aborted girl fetuses lying on the streets, that there are too many young men and they're going to all turn into this kind of rapacious horde. And this too, I think, reveals more about our own prejudices, our Malthusian desire for small populations rather than large populations like China has. And finally, China appears too centralized to us. This is a state with a very diverse population, yet which believes in a Chinese national ideal. It is not sufficiently multicultural or celebratory of difference for our Western tastes. That too, I think, reflects our own disillusionment with universalist ideals and our distaste for anything that seems national rather than ethnic and centralized rather than diffuse. This, I think, is really why China appears as so thuggish and strange to us today. It is a sinner against the Western dogma of sustainability, the Western religion of environmentalism, and the Western ideology of multiculturalism. It is too unambiguously modern and ambitious for our tastes. And I think that is the final twist in the China story today. The Chinese have, of course, as we all know, have long been seen as the other by Western observers. But today they are seen as the other precisely because they remind us too much of how we used to be in the past. That is, too big, too ambitious, too growth-driven, and too optimistic about the future.
Thank you, Brendan. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here to have the opportunity to share some ideas, some thoughts about China's rise, its impact on the country itself and on the rest of the world. I think for many of us here in the room, and certainly for myself, when we first hear the word China, what we think of is just the extraordinary growth, the extraordinary economic success that the country has experienced over the past 3 decades or so. It is a country that has grown at a rate of more than 10% per year for more than 2.5 decades. It's now the 4th largest economy, the 3rd largest trading power, and sitting on top of $1.9 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. And in the process, it has managed to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It really is an economic miracle. This economic success, I think, in turn has propelled China to a much larger role globally than it had ever experienced, at least in recent history, maybe in the past couple of 100 years. And I think it's done that to mixed results. On the positive side, certainly, China's resource quest, its quest for commodities to continue to fuel its growth, has contributed to rejuvenate economies in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia. China has become the manufacturing center of the world. It's had a very positive impact on continuing to produce low-cost consumer goods that all of us here in the United States and elsewhere in the world buy much more cheaply than we would otherwise. China has become a positive force in some cases in international affairs, stepping up to the plate to host the six-party talks, trying to bring North Korea back from the nuclear brink. It is much more engaged in peacekeeping initiatives than any time in the past. So we see that in many respects China has joined the world very fully and very positively. At the same time, of course, and in some cases I call this the unintended consequences of China's rise, China exerts a very profoundly negative impact on the world. It is the largest contributor to global climate change, courtesy of its emissions of carbon dioxide, just having surpassed the United States about a year ago or so. It is the largest importer of illegally logged timber in the world and the largest polluter of the Pacific. Its product, food and product safety issues are a concern for the entire world, and for the Chinese people themselves, certainly. Witness the recent melamine disaster that led to the death of several children and the hospitalization of tens of thousands. So there's no doubt that China's sort of pell-mell growth and its decentralized rather than centralized economy have contributed to shape the world in ways that are both profoundly positive and profoundly negative. Second point I'd like to make is that we spend a lot of time, especially I think here in the United States, thinking about the rise of China as sort of, as you put, a threat to the United States, as a challenge to U.S. leadership in the world. I think it's important to think about the way the Chinese view this. And I was in a conference a few weeks back dealing with the issue of global governance, and I was placed in the China group. It was an international conference, and I was the only person from the United States. Everybody else was from China. A number of senior Chinese officials and some scholars and some business people. And 2-1, what they said was that China is not interested in global leadership. It wants to be a responsible partner, but it doesn't want to lead. It believes that the way that it can most positively affect the world is by focusing on its domestic situation and by reforming at home. So I thought this was an interesting case. I took this back, and quite frankly, it surprised me because if you read the CIA reports or Goldman Sachs reports, all you ever hear about is China surpassing the U.S. economy by 2025, and again, assuming a much larger leadership role globally as a political force. But it seems that the Chinese are more interested in focusing on their domestic situation. I think there's good reason for that. It's a country that, according to the Chinese government statistics, confronts 100,000 protests every year. Some of these protests may be 100 farmers protesting their land being taken illegally, or it could be 30 to 40,000 people protesting those rivers that actually do run black. So these are serious issues that the Chinese people need to confront. China's health system is in disarray. Its pension system is almost non-existent. China has a lot of work to do to develop a social welfare net to protect its people. It's sort of an oddity for a socialist country. Finally, let me just make the point that whatever we like to believe, and here I probably do agree with you, Brendan, whatever we like to believe about our ability to affect China or shape China, fundamentally what China does is going to be of China's own choosing. And this is a very large country with its own interests that it pursues, just like any other state. And we can cooperate with China on lots of different issues. In some cases, we may feel the need to try to pressure China. But in essence, we're merely tinkering at the margins with this country. Just finally, if I have another minute, a couple of framing issues for the sake of this discussion. First, I guess this is a sort of an eternally interesting question now, this rise of China question. And I was thinking through earlier, why is this so interesting, or at least why has it interested me for the past 14 or 15 years? And I guess part of it is that this is a country in enormous transition. It's an economic transition, and I think probably on the brink of some kind of political transformation in the next decade or so. It's a country that wants to urbanize 400 million people between 2000 and 2030. That's the entire population of the United States that it wants to move into cities. I mean, the demographic and the geographic implications of that, I think, are mind-boggling. I don't think we have no idea what this country is going to look like politically or economically 10 or 15 years hence. And thus it makes it quite interesting to think about this rise of China. We don't even know what this country is going to look like. I think the opaque nature of its political system also makes it difficult for us really to grasp fully what's going on in this country. We can't open the newspaper one day and read, oh, Hu Jintao said this, but yesterday Wen Jiabao disagreed with him. And by the way, Li Yuanchao has a fundamentally different perspective about where this country ought to go. So that while we do have the internet and blogs and other voices certainly coming to the fore in China and many more sources of information to try to understand the country, nonetheless, we don't know what China's military budget is. There's a lot of opacity still within the Chinese political system. Again, that makes it, I think, difficult for all of us to grasp the intentions and the direction of the country. And finally, I think, and probably this will become clear over the course of the panel, and maybe it's a very obvious point, how you understand this country, which is incredibly complicated and so varied throughout the country. If you travel from one end to the next, you feel as though you're visiting many, many different countries, just like you do in the United States. But how you understand it, I think, has everything to do with how you intersect with it. And just to lay it flat out, for me, I've intersected with this country primarily through the realm of the environment. And so 14 or 15 years, I interact mostly with environmental NGO activists in China and with officials who work on the environment or energy or in the finance communities. And that profoundly shapes my perspective on this country. The way I look at it tends to be with not just factories as a source of growth, which of course they are, and an engine of this economic miracle, which of course they have been, but also the environmental devastation that these factories have wrought by the fact that 80% of them simply dumped their wastewater into local streams and rivers. And yes, the dolphins die, but more to the point, 190 million people drink water that is so polluted that the Ministry of Water Resources said that it's dangerous to their health. So I think part of the way of understanding what you're going to hear tonight is to think about how we approach these issues as an issue of how we've intersected with this country over however long it is that we've been engaging with it.
Wonderful, thank you, Elizabeth. Charles.
I think it's important, looking at China's rise, to put it in context. I mean, I think most of us are conditioned to think of this as a fairly new phenomenon. 25, 30 years, China's really taken off. But remember, for most of human history, China's been the big dog in this fight. It was until about 1810 or 1820, China represented about 30% of global economic output. So really, for most of the time that we've all been on this planet, China's really been carrying the load here. If you want to review the bidding, the United States now is about 27.5% of global output, and we're the new kids on the block. China, for a variety of reasons, whether it was foreign incursions, whether it was a failure to adapt to the Industrial Revolution, whether it was just poor planning, really started falling off in the early 19th century. And And by about 1949, it was a basket case by any stretch of the imagination. By about 1978, when the United States and China finally decided to get back together and renew our relationship, China represented less than a percentage point of global output. This is from 1/4 of the planet. So really, when we got together in 1978 or so, and after 6 years of thinking about it, the United States, started by Nixon and Kissinger, and then carried forward by Ford and then Carter, really decided, it's a really good idea, whether it's as a hedge against Soviet power, or just as a reason because you can't really ignore 1/4 of the planet. It's a really good idea to bring these guys in and talk to them and have a relationship. If for no other reason, then it's better to draw this country and draw this population into the U.S.-led economic and social order, so that to give them stakes, if you will, to give them equities in that order, so that they wouldn't challenge us, and that ultimately perhaps they would develop a political system which was more compatible with that order. That made a lot of sense in 1978 when you're at a half percentage point. No one at that point saw the economic explosion. No one foresaw 10% annual growth. So that by 2008, when China represents over 7% of global output and is fast on the rise and looking to take just past the United States 15 years from now, depending on how you count things, starting to say a policy of engagement for engagement's sake starts to look a little different, because all of a sudden the equities that China has in that global economic order have some unique Chinese characteristics. So all of a sudden China has perhaps as much say in the long-term validity of the US-led order as we do. And if you look back and say, well, this global economic order that's now under such crisis, that was started at Bretton Woods in the late 40s, if that's 60 years old, well, project yourself ahead 60 years from now as we start thinking about how to recast ourselves and what we need to do to reform the financial and the UN and all this other stuff to deal with the current crisis. Look forward 60 years. At that point, not only China will be a huge percentage point of global economic output, India is going to be even larger. So 60 years from now, China and India together are about 50% of total human economic output. So it's for a lot of years we've had this question about whether or not we should be confronting China, containing China, managing China. That's all gone. It's all about adapting to the new economic order, not of today, but of 60 years from now. And I think that's extraordinarily challenging to Americans and to anybody who looks at this, so whether they're or Londoners or Parisians or the rest. And I'm not sure that people look at China and say, we are nervous about China because of these 15 thugs. I think that's very symptomatic of a broader set of concerns that Westerners have about the rise of China. And what does it mean for us? I mean, we're used to really running the show here. It's pretty disconcerting to think of a time when we will no longer have that option. And that option, I mean, that challenge really is here now, and particularly highlighted by the financial crisis. Liz is absolutely right. China looks at the rest of the world and looks at us and says, we hear you. We hear that you're worried about a $250 billion trade deficit. We hear that you're worried about the value of our currency. We hear that you're worried about China's environmental output. We've got to fill 50,000 new jobs a day in order to manage those 100,000 local protests and prevent them from becoming a national political disaster for the Chinese Communist Party. So they hear us, and they hear our worries, and they hear our concerns, and they hear the sense that we think they're thugs and they want to improve their PR. But by and large, they're just worried about keeping the wolf from the door. By and large, they're worried about just keeping the lights on and keeping growth, so that these 50,000 people don't end up on the streets and become a challenge to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, would it be the worst thing in the world for the United States if the Chinese Communist Party collapsed? I'm not sure. We certainly have seen collapses in other places, and it hasn't always been in our interest. I think, for the most part, our political system has decided that at least maintaining stability in China is probably better for us all. But again, and as China looks out at us and says, we hear you on the question of environment, but we hear that you say that we've surpassed you in terms of global emissions, but look at the cumulative emissions over the course of the years. Even if the United States were to stop now, cumulative amounts of carbon that the United States has put in the atmosphere will dwarf those that China is putting out in the atmosphere for a period of time. That doesn't excuse it, but it certainly makes any attempt to try to manage the solution very, very difficult. I'm not sure Americans or anybody is really up to the task of looking at China and recognizing that this behemoth is on our horizon and feeling comfortable with that. I mean, there have been societies in human history which have risen to take on or risen at least to be on the same page as the status quo or rise while status quo power was out there. Sparta and Athens, the United States and Great Britain, Japan and Germany during the middle of the 20th century. I'm not sure we have the capacity to really deal with that culturally, socially, and the rest of it. But we're going to have to try because I'm not sure that the alternative is that credible. You hear a lot about, I'll just finish up with this, you hear a lot about China and the Chinese Communist Party recognizing that in order to manage themselves and manage their long-term power in China, that they're going to have to democratize. And I think a lot of us snort and say, this is just a play. But if you listen to them and you really talk to them, they're really intent on doing it, largely as a tool to maintain their own power. I mean, they're not doing it because they have some philosophical ideal that democracy is the best way of organizing society. No, they're trying to preserve a one-party democracy with the Chinese Communist Party in charge. Problem that they have as they try to look at political reform is that, by and large, with all the problems out there, democracy for the Chinese Communist Party is a little like heaven. They all want to get there, just not quite yet.
Thank you, Charles.
I agree with so much of what everybody said here. I think fundamentally the point is that China's here, it's queer, get used to it, in the non-sexual sense. The fact of the matter is that it has 100,000 protests every year, which means to some degree it tolerates 100,000 protests every year. In a really repressive society, as we know, people wouldn't do it. My expertise is really much more in Russia, and I know that a lot of people look at China, they're accused of looking at it through sort of Soviet eyes. I was warned not to do this, but I didn't have to be warned because I never saw a place that was more different from Russia than China in certain fundamental ways. Obviously, my specialty is the media. I spent a lot of time talking about it there. Is there a free press in China? I went there with the presumption of not so much. The fact of the matter is that to a great degree, there is a price to pay, but there is a vigorous amount of investigative journalism going on the local level. When it doesn't touch the center, China actually welcomes watchdog journalists. They have a great phrase for it. They call it, in true Chinese fashion, supervision by public opinion. And by that they mean, if you can find this crook governor, this provincial factory owner, whoever, and they don't have ties to the center, we will bring him down. There have also been cases where local protests have prevented factories and other things, frequently started on blogs or online and then taking fire everywhere. Cell phones are a great organizing force in China to make things happen. If this culture were as repressive as many of us begin with the thought that it is, none of this would be possible. There is a way to report from China. There's one specialist there said that there are things you can't say. He calls it the 3 T's and the F. Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, and the F is Falun Gong, the religious practice. Why? Why those things? Because for some reason, and out of force of habit, the government, you also shouldn't spend a whole lot of time chatting about the Cultural Revolution, although that doesn't fall into the strict category here. But why is that? Because the government has decided that those things, prolonged discussions of those things, threaten the stability and legitimacy of the center. also ignoring the feelings, the worries, the concerns, the safety of the Chinese people systematically threatens the stability of the center. So as Charles was saying, they have a reason, a pure survival, like most governments, whether or not there's democracy at the base, to at least keep their people fundamentally satisfied. And as we saw in that recent study, 85% or so of the people approve of the government, approve of the direction that China is moving in, more than any other country surveyed. They also feel that their leadership and generally their culture is trustworthy. That was an earlier study, a couple of years earlier. To a great degree, something over 70%. It was something like 20% in the rest of the world. And what the Chinese feel more strongly than anything in my intersections with them, Liz was talking about intersections. Basically, I tried, when I did my tour of China, I tried to talk to everybody. I talked to dissidents in California and Hong Kong. I talked to Western experts. Then I talked to working class people in Shenzhen. I talked to people in browsing in bookstores. I talked to journalists. I talked to artists. And, you know, I have to say that I spent more time in the cities, so I spoke mostly to urban populations. The vast numbers of people out in the countryside I did not speak to, so I have to leave them out of my calculations, and that's probably a disaster, but there you have it. And what I heard, basically, is there is a game you play here. We know how to play this game. We are also aware of what the government is up against, as Liz mentioned. 300 million people urbanized over the next 15 to 20 years. 400 million people lifted out of poverty in the last 20 years. A brand new wealthy class where luxury brands are just rushing in trying to support them, and a generation gap like you wouldn't believe. I spoke to students 22, 23 years old, and I said, do you have an idea of your path? Is there a pattern? Can your parents help you? What do they tell you? And they say, they don't help us. They don't tell us. They have no idea what to tell us, and they admit that. And I said, so you can't relate to your parents at all? They said, we can't even relate to our older brothers and sisters. The world that they grew up in is entirely different from mine. One thing I was told was that Jiang Zemin, who was the last General Secretary of the Communist Party and the last President of China, in his retirement speech used the word new 90 times in a 90-minute speech. He realized that this thing is unfolding like the papers flying off of the calendar in the 1940s movie. There are so many dislocations. There are so many issues there. And on top of that, this passionate desire to be a member in good standing of the world community, a sincere desire. That's what the Olympics were all about. That's why they were shocked and actually hurt when they, were reading all the remarks, and they did. They read assiduously the Western press. The remarks about goons and thugs and so on. We're normal now. I mean, several people said, why can't you see that? We're getting there. We haven't been functioning in a, they were regarding themselves as, as not a democracy, but something short of it. And they said maybe 10 years. I don't know why they make that calculation or what constitutes democracy in their mind. But the fact is they felt that they now had a give and take with the government. And to some degree they do. The government knows it can't rule from the center. So the people have a voice. Now we hear about dozens of bloggers thrown into jail. It's true. When I say it's a freer press than I anticipated, that doesn't mean it's a free press. And certainly the 3 T's and the F will do it to you. There are other things that will do it too. Almost any religious exploration could get you tossed in the clink for a while there. But the fact of the matter is, they feel that there is now a dialogue with their own government. They feel that it's their job to build a country. And over again, they said to me, people think we're robots, the very word that Brendan used. People think that we're brainwashed. We know what's going on here. We are skeptical of our media. We are aware of the incredible challenge that faces the country now. And fundamentally what they said is, we're not stupid, we're not robots, we wish our country well, and we don't understand why you don't get us. because we think we get you. One cultural arbiter there said, if you want to credit one thing for bringing China, at least in its own mind, into the world community, it's the pirated DVD, which is the #1 source of cultural exchange, and apparently had a huge impact. This is a place that in some ways is moving so fast. I thought Russia was a new country every day when I was reporting there in the mid-90s. This seems to be a new country every minute. We are going to have to cope with it. But, you know, it really doesn't matter how we feel about it, because it's there, it wants to be a member in good standing of the community. It doesn't seem to be set on world domination, and I guess I'll end there.
Thank you, Brooke. So just before I put it out to the back on one key point, because you've all kind of commented on a number of these things, and Brendan raised some points about words that were used to describe China and some of the people that were in London and Sydney recently. And Elizabeth, you were talking about the fact that, you know, there is an objective concern with what's going on with the environment, and at the same time there's 100,000 protests domestically. And in your book, Charles, you talk a lot about the relationship between the administration and the outlying regions, and some of the points you've just made, Brooke. I'm wondering what you guys think at the level of how we perceive things and the discussion we're having here in the West, and to what extent, for instance, Brendan's point that things are perceived, the West is seeing things in a very particular way through goggles of fear, and almost like China's a sinner. And to what extent that doesn't really matter. You know, some of you are actually saying, well, all of this doesn't really matter. China's going to do what it's going to do. But surely those ideas have some consequences, both for ourselves here and more broadly for them. Anyone want to take that first? Brendan?
Yeah, I think it does matter very much. And when I was in Beijing earlier this year, the thing that struck me was the extent to which lots of young people are actually falling behind the Communist Party of China and seeing it as their legitimate representative, because they are really irritated by Western demonization of China. So they're kind of hiding behind the Chinese flag. So one kind of ironic upshoot of the what I would call the kind of cultural pogrom against China over recent years is that it's made Chinese people more willing to accept the rule of their own government, which is kind of ironic, and made them quite suspicious of the West. You know, I agree with Brooke. There is this desire to engage, but it goes hand in hand with a suspicion of the West and a questioning of why do you depict us in this fashion. I think it also matters because while it's true that there is an objective issue with China's environment, I think we have to avoid this idea that the environmental discussion is just objective. It's shot through with subjectivity and with politics and with what we might call socially constructed ideas. The issue of China's environment is not a kind of hands-off scientific question. It's shot through with Western prejudices, Western subjective ideas, Western ways of viewing things, and that's kind of increasingly imposed onto the discussion about China. And I'd just like to remind people that the discussion of Chinese people as pollutants is not new. 100 years ago, the Chinese were discussed as racial and social pollutants when they were moving to America in their thousands to work. They were referred to as pollutants. Who would undermine Western civilization. Again today they are discussed as pollutants, but this time they're discussed as environmental pollutants, which can be scientifically proved in a pie chart or on a graph, but the consequences are the same, which is the idea that the Chinese are somehow a threat to the globe and Western civilization. So we need to recognize that these things have precedence and that there are politics coursing through their veins.
But are you suggesting that we shouldn't engage on the environmental issue? I mean, this is a serious issue that affects the whole world. You may say that there are precedents that suggest that this is some sort of racist smokescreen, but the fact is that these pie charts tell a very real story, don't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely we should engage, but there are two things to bear in mind here. Firstly, this is double standards on stilts, and the Chinese people are aware of that. When you have people from the West who live in air-conditioned, cushioned offices in New York or LA, or London, countries built on industrial revolutions or leaps forward, all of which were ugly, all of which were polluting, all of which were dangerous. When those people then come to China and say, how dare you pollute these rivers, how dare you dirty this water, people react very badly to that, and it's not surprising because it is hypocritical. So we need to watch the hypocritical nature of it. Secondly, we need to recognise. Secondly, we do need to recognise that the environmental discussion is not a purely objective scientific one, and question the categories that are used and the political ideas that underpin it. It's incumbent upon us to do that, so that we can engage with China more honestly and ask what lies behind the environmental engagement.
Just very quickly, I think there is something to the notion that we over-dramatize and sensationalize the problem in the Western press. I don't think it matters. Chinese don't really care that much about what we say. And so I think we can be fairly self-important in our approach and overthink how much they pay attention to the Western press, and they do, and they're sensitive to it. But I don't think it has as deep an impact on Chinese society as we might think it does. The environmental problem in China is very, very severe because it's a Chinese health issue. Millions of people are dying from environmental problems, and it's not because we're saying they're pollutants. It's an objective fact. And if you talk to any Chinese official, they'll say one of our #1 issues is the environment. It's not that the Western press is telling them that it's a problem. They recognize it.
Thanks, Charles. I'd like Liz, who's been huffing a little bit and scribbling madly, to come in on this.
Not huffing and scribbling madly, just scribbling one point. I think you just don't want to conflate things, right? So, as Charles points out, the issue of China's environment is a Chinese issue at one very important level, which is to say it's an issue not only of the Chinese people's health, which is hugely important to the Chinese people themselves and the source of about 50,000 of those 100,000 protests, so they recognize it as important, right? I mean, there are NGOs in China that spend their whole time walking up and down China's rivers documenting what they call cancer villages, right, related to this polluted water. So this is a serious issue that the Chinese people are desperately concerned about. So that's #1. #2, the issue of what China does to the global environment is, in and of itself, a set of objective facts. Whether or not the U.S. and other Western countries have previously polluted and continue to pollute, and we use 4 times or emit still we consume 3 times or 4 times as much energy per capita as the Chinese people do. It is also an objective fact. So you can deal with these things, you can comment on them, you can mention them. It doesn't mean that you are calling the Chinese people pollutants, a term I have never seen used in contemporary time. So I don't, it's one thing to discuss ideas. It's another thing just to sling ugliness.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I wish people would stop doing it. I think we need to make a distinction between the practical problem that exists in China in relation to its environment, which is a practical problem that requires practical solutions, which are being pursued. China's environment is improving. I was in Beijing earlier this year, and I was there for 6 days. 5 of them were blue sky days, and 1 was a grey sky day. These how these things are measured. If I'd been there 2 years earlier, it would have been half and half. So things are improving, and the Chinese are making efforts. You're sighing, so you obviously disagree. They obviously need experts like you to go and tell them how they should do it. The thing is, we need to make a distinction. We need to make a distinction between the practical problem of China's environment, which people are trying to resolve, and the politicization of it. Right? This is not simply objective facts. There is a politics behind it, which is used by Western governments, Western activists, Western NGOs, who think they are being scientific and objective, but in fact they are driven by a political agenda. And you can't recognize that that's a problem. Just finally, on Brooke's point earlier about conformism in China, I really agree that Chinese people are not these kind of brainwashed robots and conformists, and are actually very questioning of their own government and of Western governments. And that was a very positive thing that I witnessed there. The conformism that I find comes from Western activists who accept every dogma about the environmentalism without questioning any aspect of it, to the extent that they think it is a God-given scientific truth with no politics behind it. That's conformity.
I'm going to come over to you guys very quickly, but just to follow up on this point, a very simple question. It does seem that it's certainly the case that the discussion of the environment and the carbon footprint that we have has become very permeated every component of our discussion here in the West. A simple question. For China to pursue the kind of industrialization and carry that on to transform it in the way we're talking about, I'm wondering if the panel think that it's a positive thing in terms of development and progress and some of the terms that have now become quite unfashionable, and that can bring people out of poverty, and even if it means doing it in the same way that we've done in the West, or that is a negative thing and it should not be done.
I mean, there are 1.6 billion people on the planet that have no access to commercial energy. I'm not sure it would be responsible for anybody to say they don't deserve that access. Obviously, what you want to do is when growth is good and getting people access to power and energy and all the good things that come with it is important. The question is whether or not one needs to follow the precise development path that the West did in order to achieve that. And I don't think at this point that either China, India, or other developing countries have really engaged on what the alternatives are to that.
Any other takers?
Just briefly, I would argue that lifting people out of poverty and improving people's living conditions is something definitely worth doing, even if it means paying an environmental price. And I think we need to recognise that in the current conditions that China is in, pollution is a small price to pay for the leaps forward that are being made. And improved environments come with greater development and greater progress. History shows us that. The more China develops, the cleaner it will become, and that will be a good thing.
In the process, of course, you have 750,000 people that die prematurely every year from respiratory diseases related to air pollution. You now have China with the highest level of soil erosion in the world, and the Chinese themselves are saying if they don't tackle this problem effectively now, they're going to lose up to 40% of their grain output within the next 20 or so years. So the other point that I meant to make that I didn't is that actually one of the incredible things that's been happening in China, and that they have fully realized themselves without any real input or dogma being exported from the West, is that there's an economic cost to the environmental degradation and pollution. That in fact it's not simply health, it's not simply social unrest, but in fact the environment bites back into economic development. So if you don't have enough water to run your factories, because you haven't been conserving water, you don't price water properly, those factories can't run. You lose economic output. So these are the, Shanghai is sinking, it has sunk 6 feet or so over the past 15 years, as has Tianjin. The skyscrapers are tilting. There are huge problems that arise out of this environmental degradation and pollution that are happening now and will happen in the future. So the point is to think about growth in ways, yes, that we did not think about it, in smarter ways, to take advantage of new technologies, right? To do things differently. So that's part of it. It's not simply dogma being exported. There are real economic and health costs associated with this environment.
I want to see people indicate, and then I'm going to ask them to come to the front. You don't have to ask a question like most forums in New York or elsewhere. You can make a point, and you can challenge what you've heard, and you can bring up your own things. But I would ask you to come up to the microphone. And whilst we're thinking, you can come back on any of these points or the others that the speakers have made. You can just get on up. You don't even have to indicate and come to the microphone if you'd like to speak. I was having a bit of a conversation with Charles in the back, and we were talking about the actual Beijing opening and the scale of it all. And we were talking about how some people found it slightly scary, just the whole scale of what that could be achieved and what would mean if that's applied across the board. And the other thing I'd like us to think about is to what extent, in terms of how we're responding to these discussions and we're shaping them or not, the whole discussion about ambition and scale and the impact of that, when we often talk about today sustainable impact, and to what extent big projects and China itself, we do tend to see things in a somewhat fearful way, or it's a realistic, sensible response. When you come up and speak, could you say who you are, please?
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Julia Camden, and my question is kind of sprawling. I'm going to try to target it. I have great sympathy for China and trying to bring its 2 billion people out of poverty and do it in a measured way so that chaos doesn't come upon us. And I understand they're kind of a rock and hard place in trying to do that, particularly as Ms. Akami mentioned, in accessing the resources that they can continue to fuel this. I'm wondering, though, in their kind of the geopolitical relations, and I'm heartened by what many of you say about their intentions in the geopolitical realm, but I think there are instances where their priorities in terms of working with African nations in particular are fundamentally different, I think, right now as the West. Is that just because right now they gotta create 50,000 jobs a day? Or is that because there might be some fundamental differences or values that they have in their relations with other nations?
Thanks. I'm going to take a whole round of them, so keep coming forward, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Jack Waters. Brooke raised an interesting dilemma, I thought, which was that she said the Chinese get us. Yes, and I believe that that is true. The way they get us, as you said, is from pirated DVDs. I think that raises the question of rule of law and intellectual property. And I think that they are not unrelated to the fact that there has been the melamine contamination of product. I think the fact that the toothpaste that got into the supply chain a year or so ago. I think there are problems of quality control and respect for intellectual property which can result in these really serious health and other issues. And I think that these are, on the one hand, while it's good to find out about us through pirated material, I think there's an enormous responsibility for us in our engagement.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Orson Yi. This is a remarkable forum here. So many issues were raised. What do you thought to address it? Brandon was correct that China has been for years been stigmatized, as a boogeyman of the world, the yellow peril and such, and they're still stigmatized, for environmental issues, whatever, being the global giant as it is. But still, when Brooke said that China is not bent on world domination, I found that heartening. And I think Elizabeth also mentions that whatever China decides to do, it is up to them. It's really their decision. It's really none of our business, to tell the truth. And with that, that means that China might be on the verge of practicing a policy that our founding fathers urged Americans to practice, which is non-interventionist as a policy. As Washington said, entangling alliances with none, free trade, good world with all. Now, if China does this, I think we should leave them alone. They will come about if their solutions to their problems. And Elizabeth giving these details about 750,000 people dying and millions of whatever. Come on, this is, where do you get these facts from?
Aren't there epidemics?
But still, give China a chance. They're there, and we should let them live and let die.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more, and then I'm going to come back to the panel.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I'm very grateful to be here, and you guys, I agree with a lot of your points. I just wanted to go back to the issue of the environment. While I was a grad student, I had a great opportunity to go to China and to intern with the China Academy of Urban Planning and Design, which is right under the Ministry of Construction, a national body, and I was actually placed in the environmental unit working with the engineers. And this was 2 years ago, and the person I was working with, he's a low-level guy, starting maybe first job there, and he was asking me to help him figure out their stormwater management system in Suzhou, Shanghai, because of the poor water quality that's going on there, and how to address this issue. And so I do feel like we didn't really talk about the government side of it, but they do understand this, that they have to address these issues, and it is part of, from the bottom up even. So I think that's a positive sign. And just a second point I wanted to make, I recently read an article about students' interest in studying abroad here in the US, and China has now become one of the very top places to go. And I think that's a great sign that even the American vision and being able to really play with China in this global arena is a step forward as well.
Hi, my name is James Matthews. Question I've got is really the question of the whole session, which is China. Is it a hope or a threat? Maybe it's not can't be answered as simply as that, or it's not an either or. But it would seem, because in these sessions we're allowed to give our 2 cents, I'll give my 2 cents. I mean, it seems to me that we're overly negative about China, that we see it more as a threat. It's quite amazing what has happened in China, the development there, and it's not really celebrated in any way. In fact, you know, to take a kind of symbol of coming out of poverty, take the car, right? We're not talking about the greater potential for human freedom through mobility, and what a fantastic thing it is. It's usually seen through the you know, the potential for it to, you know, add to pollution. So, you know, I think, you know, sure, people talk on one hand or the other hand, but I think on balance, I think it tends to be more negative. If you look at, even for instance, right now, the Chinese government has just a couple weeks ago introduced the biggest stimulus package in post-war, post-Second World War, not in a wartime kind of stimulus package, and yet there are a lot of economic commentators here saying it's not enough. Chinese aren't doing enough. And you know, even the Brooke, you mentioned about the younger generation and how they might see that they don't have a past to turn to or something like that. I mean, that seems to me an odd way to look at it. I mean, it seems like, isn't it great that people have been able to go forward beyond what was in the past? You know, I think in the West we would like to see more change, right? Oh, Barack Obama, right? Hope of change, right? We're not seeing much change. In fact, we've got the opposite problem. We've got kids that graduate from college and live with their parents.
Thanks. So I'm going to come back to you guys in a second, so wait there please, but a number of questions have come up to do with the role of the government and intellectual property in law, and the fundamental one, is it a hope or a threat? Take it from this side.
I want Charles to talk about Africa.
Well, I want to talk about hope or threat first. I think the answer, is it a hope or a threat? The answer is yes. I mean, seriously, it really is. Depends on, I mean, China's the greatest self-fulfilling prophecy of our time. It can be anything we want it to be. And you're right, whether if you're Lou Dobbs, you know where you stand. And there's an easy way to achieve China as a threat. I mean, the question about whether China is as Liz said, I mean, is whether China is an outward-looking, power-projecting country, and whether it's seeking intervention and all the rest. China's mantra as it goes out in the world, whether it's Africa or anywhere, is non-interference in sovereign affairs and stability. So that gives them a lot of play when they go into Africa, and you know, they don't really have qualms about what the government is doing there and how it's shaped, and the relationship between government and civil society and people there. That's non-interference. We're going to let folks live as they live, and we're going to just do business according to our interests. It's very narrow focused. I'm not sure how long that can last. China doesn't want to be a leader, or they don't want to project themselves out there. But you know, there's a point at which, as China lines up with a group of nations on a line, they're going to find a lot of people step back, and China's going to be standing in front. How they operate then is going to be the real question.
Thanks, Charles.
You didn't talk about Africa.
I just did.
You know, I'm not sure what the relationship is between the pirated DVD and the toothpaste and Melanie scares. Actually, I mean, yes, rule of law is an issue, but if you're going to extrapolate from the DVD, then you really need to go to Lower Manhattan, because we have no rule of law down there either. And nowadays, when young people want to you know, watch material from the West or anybody, mostly they watch it online. Everybody watches everything online. Almost everything is downloadable. They don't really need the pirated DVD as a form of cultural exchange. I know China is interested in dealing with the issue of intellectual property because it makes them better world citizens, and they haven't ignored it. I don't think it's their top priority. In terms of the dangerous product, you know, quality control issues, they recognize this as both a public relations disaster as well as, you know, a public health disaster. That's the sort of thing that my impression is it happens on the local level, and when these guys get caught, they tend to get prosecuted for it. This isn't something that the central government is shielding them from. But it's a huge, it is a huge place, and the problem is it's very hard for us to grasp the scale of what's going on there. I was talking to Josh Ramo, who spent a lot of time there from the Kissinger Institute, and his impression of the place, and he lives there most of the time, is that the government is constantly running behind events, trying to fix them after the fact, and isn't able to get ahead of them. That's his impression. And, from the people that I spoke to, that is how they see their own country, that their government is fundamentally a benign and positive, but not terrifically efficient engine. And in terms of the issues that I went there about, that I care about, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, there are these red lines around certain things, and a great deal of freedom elsewhere.
Thanks, Brooke. I'm going to ask the panelists to be quick because there's a lot of speakers. Elizabeth.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. I think Charles is fundamentally right on the issue of Africa. I would only add that you already see now that Chinese workers, oil workers, like Americans in the past and Europeans as well, are being kidnapped and killed in a number of places in Africa. I think this is promoting a different sense of China as its oil companies are going abroad, its natural resources are going abroad. And I know that there have been a lot of protests against Chinese natural resource companies, mining companies, et cetera, in a number of African and Latin American countries, and that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite concerned about what this is doing to China's image, because the Chinese government doesn't feel as though, even though these are state-owned companies by and large, they have any control over what these companies are doing in terms of labor and safety and environmental practices. So I think there's a lot about China's view of not mixing business with politics, of sovereignty, respecting the sovereignty of the state, that I think is going to evolve as China becomes more deeply involved in these countries. Rule of law, make a joke a little bit about the DVD thing, but it is one of the absolute most fundamental, important issues in the country today, because it underpins everything in local governance. So whether you're talking about the environment or public health or intellectual property rights violations, when you're looking for the source of those 100,000 protests, it boils down to rule of law. It boils down to the fact that the Chinese people do not feel that they have a way of getting redress through the political system. It's not as though 30,000 people storm 13 chemical factories just on a whim. It's because for 2 years they've been trying to work through the system to get the problem taken care of, and they can't. So the DVD might be a funny example, but the problem is a real one, and it's a huge one, along with official accountability and transparency. And last point, where do I get my facts? I have to answer that. The Ministry of Water Resources is the source for the fact on the 190 million people drinking contaminated water that's dangerous to their health. The World Bank and the State Environmental Protection Administration did the study on 750,000 people dying prematurely because of respiratory disease related to air pollution. And Xinhua came out with a report on soil erosion just about a few days ago. So anybody who wants to know about sources, you just come to me.
Actually, following on from that, the gentleman who questioned some of these facts, I think he's absolutely right to do that. I know it's blasphemy these days to question environmentalist facts, and someone may call me a denier or a heretic or something. But lots of things are being conflated here. Respiratory problems, for example. In the past, we would have recognised these as deaths from poverty, effectively. In Britain, where I come from, you are far more likely to die of a respiratory problem if you live in Glasgow than you are if you live in Islington in London. That's because Glasgow is fundamentally poorer. It's dirtier. There's less decent healthcare. The air is not very nice. And this is where the discussion of China does matter. This is where the interplay of Western NGOs, Western activists, Western ideology does matter, because things are being obscured. And often deaths from what we would have called poverty in the past are dressed up as deaths from pollution or deaths from some kind of malice. And that's a real problem, because the answer to the kind of stats that Elizabeth is talking about is more growth, more progress, more cleanliness as a result of that, rather than the demonization of growth as the killer of people. So this is a really urgent problem, to clarify what these facts mean and to interrogate them and not accept these facts as gospel truth, because they're not.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Asha Kasperi. I actually was a former study abroad student in Shanghai, China, in 2005. Well, I was just wanted to discuss regarding the Western perception about China. We're discussing here, okay, China might be the dominating world power in the next 24 years, but we should also realize that not only the Westerners feel that way, but we have their neighboring countries who are contributing to that to that perception. For instance, Japan, who actually fear the fact that what's going on with China, telling the United States, hey, you should be careful with China, this and that. So their neighboring countries are actually an issue with the perception we have, the modern perception we have with China. Also, the media also is really responsible for it. Just like the other day I was watching CNN and they were talking about how the Chinese were hacking into the United States systems. I mean, you have stuff like that where people feel like they're threatened and unsafe. So I just want to point that out.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Nick Dahlheim. A couple things put together. I wish people would discuss Malthus a little more. I would consider myself a Malthusian, and I guess I disagree very strongly with Brandon on almost everything. I think the idea of that they're questioning scientific objectivity. Yes, there's always politics and science, but for the most part, the trends in China's environment are really quite awful. And the answer is not more growth. If you look back at 1800s industrial Europe, the whole population of Europe was maybe 100, 200 million. So we're talking about scale, an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude larger. And not only China, but you have India and the rest of the world wanting to grow at exponential rates with a population that's going to reach 9.5 to 10 billion people in the next 50 years. So we have to honestly be thinking about, is growth even a model for solving problems? We have to find some way to not grow, I think, and have prosperity.
Now that we've done it, they shouldn't do it.
I'm going to keep on asking your questions and making your points. We're going to go through quite a few now before I come back to the panel. You'll get a chance to come back on all of these things.
Okay.
Jean Smith.
I'm Jean Smith from the New York Salon. It's a long time since I've been to a meeting where people have argued that there are far too many Chinese people and Indian people being allowed to breed. But I wanted to speak to this whole issue of the environment, because I think it reflects our attitude to people and modernity. Because if you look at the development of capitalism within Western societies, and I can talk the most about England because that's where I'm from, is that there were obviously huge problems and there were huge public health issues. Even though there weren't a lot of people, there were huge public health issues. And what the state did, sometimes because it was acting in its own interest, but sometimes because it was forced to by the British people, is it introduced things like, the most important thing it did was it introduced the public sewage system to clean up the water and to get rid of disease. And then it introduced all sorts of regulations in terms of the amount of time people could work. And in the 50s and the 60s, it introduced smokeless fuel to clean up the air. But the fundamental underlying premise was that material development was a good thing, and it was good to raise people's material standard of living. Whereas now, I think, if you look at the discussion on China, and it's not just about China, it's also when we discuss issues, in relation to the US as well. Elizabeth, you write in your paper that was in Current History, which is on our website at the moment, that the solution to the problem is in effect that we need to price resources such as water and energy so as to encourage conservation and efficiency. So what you're basically saying is people should drink less water, and then further on you talk about the fact that we may have to close factories, and it's all in your paper, workers will be laid off, etc. And it seems to me that there's a different, there's a different mindset when we talk about China, is that we're looking into the mindset of let's slow it down. let's limit what's going on. And I really agree with the point that Brendan made, that actually, it's a question of our attitude to problems that face us at the moment. Is it that we see people as problem solvers, or people as causes of the problem? Because what is the alternative in China? The alternative in China is that people live in rural poverty. Women die in childbirth, because they're because of malnutrition. And I think, we're not saying to China, well, slow down your growth because we think you're not ready for it, and meanwhile you'll live the way we do. What we're saying is to China, slow down growth, and meanwhile live in rural poverty, instead of taking all the energy and creativity of the Chinese people and channeling that into coming up with some solutions, to any problem that might arise.
Okay, I'm going to ask people to be slightly shorter now because we're running out of time a little bit, and I want everyone to get a chance to say something before I come back to the panel.
My name is Mike Strauss. Again, to the poverty issue, you talked about facts and you supported your facts, and up there you all didn't really dispute the facts. It's more about how it's presented, and I'm just unclear what you mean by the how it's politicized. I don't think anybody's saying that you should slow down growth. That's not fair. You can't say they can't own a DVD and a refrigerator and all that. And frankly, I don't think because that actually says that you either have to live in the rural village and die there, or live in a city and die there, and nobody's saying that. It's just, the rich people, if coal is a big problem, for instance, and 75% of the power is from coal, the rich people in their, Mercedes and all that in their houses are, using coal, and, so are the poor people. So how is it politicized if the facts are the facts, and, there has to be a good solution?
Right, thank you. I'm going to start interrupting people now, so I'm going to try and get it quite short. So.
Okay, very well. I'm taking you what you're worried about, asking about China as a threat. Well, number one, Brooke, I hope your program is presented at some better hour, although I'm an early Sunday morning or Saturday morning listener. But maybe WNYC can do something. But in any case, the threat about China is, what about our relations with the United States as far as holding our debt? Are they going to hold it? Does anybody have any opinions on that? Are we going to default, or what's the future of that?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jerry Ekdahl, and I'm a graduate student right now at New York University in the Global Affairs program. I traveled this June of this year to Shanghai, so that was my first trip to China, and since then have been sort of extremely fascinated by a number of different issues. My question specifically is regarding international security aspect, and I know that a lot of our discussion this evening has been trying to answer the question of, is China a threat to us? And I'd sort of like to reframe that in a different perspective of, to what extent does China consider the US a threat to their security, and mostly due to our buildup of US military presence in the Taiwan issue, and a lot of China building up their military in response to this escalating potential for conflict between US and China. So what is your view on that? Thank you.
Wow, you're the most open-minded panelist in my entire 21 years living in the USA. I hope one day you'll make it to mainstream media, like the CNN, the whole echelon. Anyway, my name is Jia Wang. I'm a real estate broker in New York. The difference between me and most of the audience here is that I was born and raised and one of the brainwashed, quote unquote, robots in Beijing, right near Tiananmen Square. And I was born in 1965, so right in the middle of all that. Even though my younger generation find me a dinosaur probably, but so I want to comment on Brendan's. You are so. I mean, of course, all the panelists too, but you mentioned that the cultural program. You mentioned the cultural program sort of on China or against China, or in other names, China bashing, has caused some Chinese to actually be for our government. You couldn't be more correct on that. I want to comment on from my point of view. When we first come from China to the U.S., we were complaining about everything about China. Our wall is crooked. Our sky, our moon was crooked. Our everything is wrong. Our bathroom, anyway. Then when we came here, when we see how the Western world, the sluggish or all kinds of comments. So a lot of my friends living in the U.S. don't understand. My 3 generations in my family, my 5 generations within my family, we were all persecuted. There are millions like me who now live in the U.S. They are financial analysts, they are bankers, they are CFOs, they could be anything, doing all kinds of stuff in New York. They are so pro-China. 85% of Chinese people are pro-China, whether they're in China or outside of China. And the other 15% who are not pro the government is because they probably are relatives of the Communist Party. We were persecuted. My grandfather, we were on jail. Everybody was persecuted. So anyway.
Okay, you have to wind up now.
Yeah,
Thank you.
wind up. I guess another comment I want to just quickly mention, which I'll finish in 2 sentences. People are wondering, why is Mao still in fashion? Why we're still so in love with Mao and Dalai Lama is not? We are not so hot on Dalai Lama like people like me. I tell you why here. I just found a book. I was so curious why the Western media, after all this hype on Dalai Lama, they don't mention where he come from. But here's a photo. If the Westerners think that Dalai Lama is a great fortune teller, we think Mao is a better fortune teller. And here's a photo of Dalai Lama and Mao, and you will see the admiration of Dalai Lama towards Mao. That's why. One of the.
I'm going to be very intervening now. People have got to be quick because I want to get everyone in.
My name is Charlie Zhang. I think a few panelists closer.
Yes.
A few panelists mentioned this kind of discussion it will help China or not, but I believe it will do because I remember before the Hong Kong handover, they have a little talk between late China leaders Deng Xiaoping and former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of England. One of the things she mentioned to Deng Xiaoping, she said we have no problem to hand over the Hong Kong to China because the 100 years is up. So the one problem we have, the Hong Kong system is capitalism. We don't want to be changed completely communism because we drove away all the economy. So the Deng Xiaoping say, okay, this issue I never thought about it, but we need a few days to work on it. When we return to continue talk, I should have the solution. So a few days later, they continued the talk. The Deng Xiaoping told Margaret Thatcher, he said, okay, we figured out finally. So we do the one country, two system. So the Hong Kong remained the capitalism. So that's a help the Hong Kong, remain the democratic system, I believe.
Hi, I'm Matthew Glaberman, a Western Connecticut State University student. I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate here. We shouldn't maybe looking at China as they're the evil ones. Why are we looking at USA as we're moving our United States businesses and corporations moving, factories over to China and not really caring about the humanitarian and paying pennies on the dollar? It's not necessarily China being at fault in their environmental and humanitarian ways. We didn't look at what the U.S. needed to do to prosper and transferring jobs over there. So that's the devil's advocate there.
Thank you. And I think that's the last. I've got time for one more speaker.
Alex Standish. I thought the environmental issue might be a topic of conversation here tonight, so I took the trouble to look up a couple of health statistics before I left. Recent UN reports is the average life expectancy in China has risen to 72 in the year 2005. which is 1.6 more years than in 2000. In 1949, life expectancy was 36.5 years. So it's nearly doubled in some 60 years. And other statistics reveal the same levels of progress. So infant death rate decreased to 1.5%, down from 2.5% in 2003. So and that's just over the last few years. So again, I'm not saying there aren't environmental problems, but I think what the discussion has revealed to me is that clearly our limited imagination when it comes to discussing the environment and growth and so forth is very much colouring the way we're looking at China. We talk about natural resources today, but it wasn't always like that. We used to in the past talk about human resources. If you remember, stuff, fossil fuels, uranium, metals and so forth don't become of any use to us until human resources put those things to good use. So our imaginations is what turns resources into something useful. So resources are not something finite. They're something that can expand. So just quickly a question. If we're looking at China with these with limited imaginations ourselves, what impact is that having on China's view of itself? Is it limiting their horizons in terms of growth at all?
Thank you. So we asked the panelists to sum up and respond, which is a very enormously difficult task for the amount of questions and points that have been raised. As ever, we will raise far more issues perhaps than we can resolve. But we're going to go in reverse order, and a couple of the things that I would like to hear what the panel have got to say, as well as their summary, are a couple of these key points about how much is it limiting people in China, and to what extent creativity is being limited or not by our perspective. And I'd ask Brooke to start off with.
China is not limited by what we think of it. China cares about being a citizen of the world, but you're absolutely right. It's not something that they obsess over day after day. China is working on its own problems. That doesn't mean that China can't benefit from the expertise and technology of the West. I've been surprised by a lot of the comments suggesting that, Liz can defend herself, but that she wants to suppress growth and she wants to infantilize the Chinese people and so on. I think that you identify problems and you work together as a world community, putting all of those, all that creativity and all that expertise to bear on that problem, not just China, but worldwide. I'd be interested to hear what the position is on growth right now. I think China has always been keenly aware of, the issue of growth and population of all those things, and it has gotten quite a lot of Western criticism with their one-child policy. I've met many young people across all generations and all classes who don't actually have a problem with the one-child policy, something that I can't imagine people in the West would. I'm sure some people do. My experience is limited and I've never seen a poll, so I can only go with my anecdotal experience. But I do certainly know that here, any government interference in family planning to that degree would never be countenanced. It's, my feeling is that there is a great deal of possibility in China. My answer to the question, as Charles was, is yes. China, threat, menace, hope, salvation, all those things. It's the biggest country. It's gaining in wealth. It brings tremendous consequences along with its development. And I'm not afraid of China. And I think fundamentally, after my trip across China, that's what I walked away with.
Thank you, Brooke. Charles.
I've been studying and working with China for 28 years, and I go to China every 6 weeks or so, and the more I go, the dumber I feel. There's a saying among China watchers that if you go to China once, you can write a book. You go to China for a year, you can write an article. At this point, I'm even surprised I can stand up and look at you all in the eye. The issue is China is such a society of contrast. Every exception proves the rule. And so it's very easy and tempting because of it's so difficult to understand to try to paint in broad brushstrokes. And I think that's a challenge for us. as we look at China. I mean, the question of growth versus environment and all this stuff. I mean, look, I mean, I don't think anybody reasonably has a desire to shut out the desires of 1.3 billion people to live as well as they can. The reality is that the United States has an extremely robust and rich relationship with China on issues of energy and environment. And there's, you know, if you look at what's happening, the United States and China actually have a 10-year plan to manage climate change between them, manage energy between them. But it's not simply a case of saying, okay, we've got to curb the desires of the average citizen to do better, to use more energy, etc. If you look at the real energy use and environmental use in China, from 1980 till about 2000, energy efficiency improved over 2/3. It was dramatic. Starting in 2000, what happened? It went right back up. Why? Because Chinese started doing something that they shouldn't be doing. By any stretch of the imagination, it makes no economic sense. They're using energy intensively to produce steel, concrete, all this stuff that is much more efficiently done overseas. So it's not about trying to prevent the average citizen from buying a DVD player. It's trying to look at the provinces all over China that have gone from being a net importer of steel and steel products to being a net exporter. It's about the Chinese government preventing the export to China of energy-saving and efficiency-producing technologies. It's not black and white, as much as we'd like to make it. As far as debt holding, again, it's not black and white. If China were to use U.S. debt assets and to try to be strategic and create a rest, they go down with us. We're tied at the hip. They know it, we know it. Paulson and his counterparts spend, you know, three or four sessions a week talking about managing the U.S. debt and managing the interrelationship of the Chinese economy. We're connected, and it's not a question of saying how do we stop it, how do we prevent it. We're not going to stop Chinese growth. It ain't going to happen. And whether you're Malthusian or not, it really doesn't matter. The question is how do we deal with it.
Thank you, Charles. Elizabeth.
So just a couple of points. I'm going to skip the environment or my defense because I think actually Brooke and Charles did a nice job of it for me. I would only suggest that you actually read more carefully what I write, and I think you'll perhaps have a different perspective. Let me just say on the issue of national security, because we didn't talk about it, I think, you know, I'm not worried about the issue of Taiwan. The U.S. and China for 20, almost 30 years now have had a very stable relationship marked by a few sort of sharp spikes, problematic spikes, like after the Belgrade bombing or the downing of the EP-3, a couple of points in time where we've had some difficulties, but within a few months, usually, the relationship has stabilized again. I think there's a commitment in Beijing and in Washington to maintain a stable relationship and a consideration that this is one of the most important bilateral relationships for both countries. So I'm not so worried about Taiwan, plus they have a new leader in Taiwan that actually favors closer ties with Beijing. So it's a shift, a geostrategic shift that I think could prove actually transformative sometime in the future. We'll have to wait and see. I'm just going to conclude by saying three things. In the end, here's what you should take away. Forget all the environmental stuff. Go read for yourselves. Go find your own statistics and interpret them any way you want. But I think the impact of China on the world is profound. Our capacity to shape the country is limited, and our ability to understand it is questionable.
Brendan.
Okay, the gentleman in the audience said facts are facts. Well, facts aren't always facts, and more to the point is there's the question of how you respond to those facts and how you deal with them, and that's a political issue. So when our self-confessed Malthusian says that there is too much economic growth, is growth necessarily a model? There are too many people, especially in India and China, because there's always too many people in India and China. We don't want too many of them. And my esteemed colleague next to me was nodding vigorously along. Those are political responses.
He never said it.
Those are
I never said too.
Hold on, I'm heckling, please.
You can re-watch the video. He said that the population levels in India and China were rising, and that we're going to have a world with 10 billion people, and that's somehow a problem. Yeah, it's true. So this is the point I'm making. There are facts, and then there are the way you respond to those facts. There is the fact about respiratory problems in China. That is a fact. But then there's a question of response. Do you respond by encouraging China to import New York-made, trendy, energy-efficient methods, or do you encourage it to go more for growth and to alleviate poverty once and for all? I prefer the latter solution, other people prefer the former. And so it's a political debate. Let's not dress everything up as a scientific fact. It's not like that. I am very concerned about the role of Western NGOs and Western activists in China. I agree that their ability to shape China is fairly limited, but they are having an impact. And it's like imperialism in reverse in many ways. Because, you know, the old-fashioned Western imperialism was about going to a country and taking its resources and having this huge political impact in order to satisfy economic growth in the West. Now what you have is a situation where people, Western activists, go to these third world countries and say economic growth is somehow problematic. It has to be slowed down or changed or reshaped or rethought. It's causing too many problems. It's like imperialism reversed. We had the white man's burden in the past. Now we have the green man's burden, and that's a real problem. So, and that needs to be rethought. And these people cannot present themselves as just the harbinger of facts when they are pursuing what is a political agenda. Is China a hope or a threat? I think there is we have seen enormous potential in China and the possibility of humanity itself in the way in which China has leapt forward in recent years. And the developments that have taken place have been awe-inspiring, I think. But the question of whether it will be a hope or a threat really does depend more on us than on China itself. China is fairly unstoppable, but how we relate to it and how we decide to develop the relationship with China is going to be key. So I would argue for some more honesty in the discussion, some more upfront ideas, and just a genuine acceptance of Chinese people's desires to live the same way that we live, which is their right to do so.
Thanks. Before I ask you to thank the panel, a couple of points. We've always thought at the New York Salon that ideas do in fact have consequences wherever they are in the world, and whether you're infuriated by this or you're inspired or you think of it as no consequence, I would invite you to come and buy the books that the speakers may well sign for you and carry on the discussion. Some of us will be going on, if people want to carry on, over at O'Neill's afterwards, to carry on drinking and arguing and having this discussion on, because we won't resolve these issues, but it's a good starting point. And with that, I'd like you to thank the panel for a lively debate. Brendan, we've just been into Is America Still the World's Policeman? And tell us a little bit about your thoughts about that.
I think America is not still the world's policeman, and I think that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because America's domination of the world was not necessarily positive or progressive. It led to lots of violent conflict in Vietnam and elsewhere. And it's a bad thing because America's role has kind of collapsed inward rather than having collapsed as a result of an external challenge. It's collapsed because the world has changed since the end of the Cold War, which makes it far more difficult for America to dominate the world in the way that it used to. The world is not so neatly split anymore between the East and the West, which allowed America to lead the West in this kind of union against the evil empire. But it's also collapsed because America has lost faith in its own role effectively and is suffering from a very long-term, deep, serious crisis of legitimacy that goes right back to post-war America, actually, you know, in the 1950s and the 1960s, and which really came to a head with the Vietnam conflict and the Vietnam syndrome, which really was less about defeat in Vietnam than it was about America's inability to convince or win over or have a decent political relationship with its own population. So I think two significant things have happened. Firstly, the world has changed. It's no longer easily, neatly divided. And secondly, America has lost faith in its own ability to direct or lead the West. Both of those things mean that it's no longer the policeman.
There are some people that perhaps would think that's a really wonderful thing. Some people of the old left, for instance, that may have said that America's role wasn't necessarily a role of positive impact in the world. What are your thoughts about that?
I think the problem is that America's role is now in some ways even more dangerous than it used to be, because at least when America had some sense of what it was about and why it was intervening around the world, which was normally a way of displaying its moral authority and controlling foreign events, at least then there was some logic to it, there was some end point, there was some sense to these interventions, and they were violent, they were bloody, they were horrendous, but they were controlled in some way. But the kind of conflicts that America is launching now, and most explicitly in Iraq, are kind of knee-jerk interventions, which are driven by indecision, actually, and by risk aversion, and by a desire to keep the kind of marauding savages at bay. And it's driven much more by a sense of defensiveness in America. And they can be even more dangerous, because as we've seen in Iraq, there is no logical endpoint. There is no imposition of a new government. There is no attempt to impose a clear American will. And instead, you topple the regime, everything spins out of control, and it leads to anarchy. The kind of anarchy that you didn't have, actually, in Vietnam, which was an old-fashioned conflict between one side and another. So the loss of America's policeman role is positive in the sense that America no longer dominates the world in the way it used to. That's a good thing. But it's negative because America still intervenes all over the place, but with a much more uncertain attitude, which can lead to inexplicable, strange, long-standing conflicts.
So you're actually saying, and to cite something like Georgia recently and what was happening with Russia, there's a tendency for things to be more out of control and more problematic. I mean, how do you see that panning out over the future?
Yeah, I think Georgia is a very good example of the dangerous nature of contemporary Western foreign policy and American foreign policy in particular, where you act in a very juvenile fashion, actually, and you don't think through the consequences of what you're doing. And that's because American foreign policy is not grounded in any kind of ideology or political idea or any kind of sense of what America is about. Instead, it's just about moral posturing and trying to develop easy relationships without thinking through what the consequences of those relationships might be. So America, over the past 10 years has been arming Georgia, training its military, effectively cajoling it to stand up to Russia and to become more aggressive. And then earlier this year, that spins out of control. Georgia, which is a fairly infantile state, takes the green light from America, launches an attack on Russian forces, and then it leads to a short-term but very bloody conflict. And I think we may see more of that kind of thing as America intervenes around the world without any sense of what it's doing and without thinking through the long-term consequences of or the shakeout of those kind of events.
Brendan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Alan Miller at the Battle of Ideas with Brendan O'Neill and Fora TV.